London, 1670. The air is damp and the streets are muddy, and the wooden benches of the Old Bailey are crammed with onlookers. Two men, William Penn and William Meade, both Quakers, stand accused of, quote, an unlawful religious gathering. At the time, England's laws had mandatory attendance at Church of England services and forbade public worship by other faiths. Penn and Meade had been preaching in the open air to a crowd of fellow Quakers. Now, while it was peaceful, it was still illegal. The trial was a farce from the start. The judge ordered the jury to convict, but the jurors, led by Edward Bushel, refused. The court's response was shocking. The jurors themselves were locked up with no food, water, or heat, until they, quote, came to their senses. After days had passed, the jurors still refused. And their stubbornness gave birth to a landmark decision known as Bushel's case, which ruled that jurors could not be punished for delivering a verdict according to their conscience. It was a major step towards religious freedom, the right to trial by jury, and the principle that certain rights exist beyond government reach. Now, anytime you've been pressured to just go along with something you knew was wrong, you felt a faint echo of what those jurors faced. Do rights come from the government, or are they something we already have simply by being human? That's the question that sits at the heart of libertarian philosophy, and we're going to break down rights today. What are they? What are the different kinds? And why libertarians believe only one type, natural rights, can form the foundation of a truly free society. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Foundations of Liberty here on the Chris Spangle Show. I am so thankful that you are here and grateful. And if you're watching live, please hit the share button and we can spread the word about what we're doing here, which is going back to principles and exploring what is the foundation of a healthy society where people are respected, where people are given both liberty and dignity to achieve what they believe is the best for themselves. We call that self-government in the libertarian space. And one of the foundational principles is rights, all right? So let's talk about rights. Rights are moral or legal entitlements that set boundaries for what others, including the government, may do to you or require of you. They protect your freedom, dignity, and autonomy, right? And so today we're going to talk about two different types of rights. Moral rights, rooted in ethics and human nature, and natural, which are sometimes called natural rights, and legal rights, which are created and enforced by the government. From a libertarian perspective, rights aren't a gift from lawmakers. Your state senate does not convene to tell you what your rights are. We don't need the government to tell us, for instance, that murder is wrong. Murder is wrong because it is a violation of our conscience and of natural rights. And they're built into our nature as human beings. Governments can recognize and protect them, or they can violate them, but they cannot legitimately create them. So how do we know what a natural right is? So there is a phrase that libertarians common go back to, which is, don't hit people, don't take their stuff. It's the basic rules that you learned as a kid. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. Don't, if you are harming another person or their property, then that generally is a natural right that you are, that cannot be created by the government. It's just the governments are recognizing that we are all inherently created with this right to life, liberty, and property. So let's move on just to a brief history of natural rights and how this developed. John Locke is often mentioned, and he argued in his second Treatise of Government in 1690 that all people were born with the rights to life, liberty, and property, which then was taken in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, where they wrote, "We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights," meaning they pre-exist the state. And why was this a watershed moment? This is the first time that a government was founded with the notion that you are a self-governing being that has certain inalienable rights that cannot be violated by the government. Whereas all governments in existence at the time and before had been rights had been bestowed upon you by the king, by the clan leader, by the tribe, and you were the individual was not supreme. So it was a huge moment in history when the American Revolution took place and the Declaration was written. So let's give you some examples in daily life of natural rights. Freedom of thought and speech. You can express your thoughts without being arrested. Freedom of religion. You can attend or not attend to worship as you choose. There's no trial against open-air preaching. Maybe some of you think there ought to be, but there isn't. You can go to a college campus and scream at the people calling them harlots and all kinds of things, and you won't go to jail. Oh, Brother Jim. I don't know. Did you have a Brother Jim on your college campus? We sure did. And then property rights. You own your home and possessions, and no one can take those away from you without due process. Due process is a key part of this, right? Natural rights doesn't mean that the government recognizes these rights and you get the ability to do whatever you want. Government is there to protect other people from evil, right? A murderer needs to be locked up. A thief needs to be locked up. You know, the government needs to recognize that someone can't invade your home and set up shop and say, this is my house now, just because they have 2 more guns than you do. So the government really is there to help set those boundaries and protect natural rights. So I mentioned legal rights. So what are legal rights? They are rights created and enforced by governments. They can reflect natural rights or contradict them, and they can be changed or removed. So examples are the right to vote. Okay, that varies by county, by state, by country, and it is really the government setting up, here's the rules of the road in terms of voting. Public education guarantees. For instance, in Indiana, you are guaranteed the right to a public education via our Constitution. We have a city called New Harmony, settled by George Rapp, an early socialist here in America, and then they failed and moved on, and Robert Owen moved in, another socialist. That collapsed after a couple of years, but his sons were very influential, and they wrote into the Constitution that every Indiana citizen is guaranteed the right to a public education. Government set minimum wage laws, right? So every worker is guaranteed in America to be paid $7.25. Right? You are not, by virtue of being alive, guaranteed income. You are not guaranteed a service, for instance, the labor of other people, right? You are not guaranteed health care, for instance. That's not a right because you are forcing other people to work on your behalf, to pay on your behalf, and that's not a right. So Libertarians generally argue that legal rights, are legitimate only when they serve to protect natural rights, not to replace or restrict them. So a legal right is your right to life, where you will not be murdered by other people. The state will prosecute anyone who terminates that right to life. So that is both a natural right and a legal right. You know, these ideas weren't decided by some council long ago and some person wrote them down. We tend to, I think, truncate this down into the Declaration of Independence was written, and that's how America was formed, and we got it all right, and we put all these laws down. It's like, and then people are kind of surprised to find out that we had the Constitution written, like, I think it's like 11 years later, right? It's constantly a process of negotiating these things. But this theory developed from no single person or government. They didn't get invented. The idea developed over centuries through a mix of philosophy, religion, and political struggle. And it's more like a chain of thinkers and events than a single moment of discovery. So let's go back to ancient times, right? Stoic philosophers like Cicero in 1st century BC argued that there is a natural law, a universal moral order discoverable by reason that applies to all people everywhere. And he wrote that true law is right reason in agreement with nature, suggesting that justice exists independent of government. Let's move on to some religious influences. The Judeo-Christian view that humans are made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, gives each person an inherent worth. And Christian thinkers like Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas argued that rulers are bound by God's higher law, and that laws that contradict it are unjust. Then there are the medieval legal traditions, like the Magna Carta in 1215, where there were political compromises, but they introduced the principle that even kings are not above certain laws. And over time, English courts began treating customs like property ownership and trial by peers and lawful assembly as pre-existing rights that the crown had to respect. Because even though we are awash in talk of authoritarianism and we have these examples from the 20th century of some of the most brutal dictatorships in history, even those people, the most ruthless dictators, still had courts. Even Henry VIII had a court. And King John, for instance, in the case of the Magna Carta, went too far in taxation and taking privileges that he thought were his right to treat people however he wanted. He wanted to treat his nobility however they were servants of the king, right? And it eventually goes too far that they rebelled and wrote the Magna Carta. And so there is always a tension between the ruled and the rulers. And that has existed in the history of time. And what this natural rights tradition is defining those things, right? You don't have the right to come and take people and sell them and treat them and murder them and sexually assault them, right? Like, you have a natural right to your dignity to not be assaulted. So then we get to the Enlightenment, and some of these things start to develop a little more. Hugo Grotius in the 1600s claimed natural law would still exist even if God did not, grounding it in human reason. And again, John Locke, who is a huge step forward in defining natural law in the political sense, built the most famous case, arguing that in, quote, the state of nature, all people possess life, liberty, and property, and governments exist only to protect them. And thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire expanded the idea to free expression and religious liberty and fair trials. So then you have some moments of political adoption, cases like Bushel's case that we opened with. You have a trial by jury. They're human guarantees and property rights. Others can't take your possessions. And the U.S. Declaration and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789 cemented those ideas into modern politics. You have in rights, right? Let's think of a couple different buckets here. Property. If you own your body and your labor, you own what you produce, right? So that's why property exists. And this is always under attack from, I'm not going to get into the Marxists and call everybody communists, but this is why libertarians affirm property rights so strongly, and some even call it the core of libertarian philosophy, because if you own your body and you own what you do with it via labor, then you own what you produce. Taking it without consent is stealing, but if other people are taking the fruits of your labor without your consent, then they're stealing. And assembly, right? If you have the liberty of movement and association, you can gather peacefully with others. It's a natural extension of personal freedom. So you have the right to move. And this is why libertarians tend to trend away from closed border immigration policies like we've seen with recent administrations, because you have the freedom to move and associate with people. You have the freedom to hire who you want. And why does the government get the right to stop you from moving to a place where you have more economic freedom? Why does the government have a right to keep you from hiring people who are seeking that life? The government has to justify why it's doing those things, which is why it's such an anathema for so many libertarians and public libertarians to be super hardcore about immigration controls, as opposed to, I sort of see that as a failure of libertarian imagination. It doesn't mean that you have to be open borders, for instance, and look, we have no borders, just come on in, enjoy the welfare, have fun, right? That's not what most people believe, not what a lot of libertarians believe, but can we find a middle ground that is closer to freedom than building walls? So natural rights are not something that a ruler can hand out. Natural rights are not something that a ruler can hand out. They're part of being a human, discovered through reflection and experience, and often through resistance to oppression. They are defined, like in the civil rights era, the right to vote. If someone is ruling over you, who is the government to say you don't have the ability to come in and make your voice heard, right? So let's move on to positive and negative rights. This is something that was discussed a lot during the Obama era. The libertarian standard is negative rights. So what does that mean? Negative rights require others not to interfere with your life. They don't demand that anyone give you something, only that they leave you free. So some examples are free speech. Others can't silence you. The government can't silence you, all right? You do have freedom of association. You can say whatever you want, but other people may hear what you say and not like it and not want to associate it, including your job. You do not have a right to employment just because you hold extreme beliefs. Religious liberty. Others can't force you to worship in a certain way, right? Again, the freedom of association exists, but in general, we should strive to see others say out loud what they think and worship in ways that they want. And then we can take that information in and decide if they're people that we want to associate with and vice versa. Others can't take your possessions without consent. And these align with the non-aggression principle. No one should initiate force against another person. We don't initiate force against another person to achieve social or political goals. That's the libertarian pledge. So what are positive rights? It is demands for action. It's requiring often the government to provide goods and services, like a right to health care. The government must fund medical care. The right to education. Government must provide schools. The right to housing. Government must supply shelter. So these are all good things, right? Like, we want people to be healthy. We want people to be educated. We want people to be housed. Like, these are fundamentally good things for every human being, that it not just improves the life of that individual, but it also improves the health of the overall community. So what are libertarian critiques of that? Why would that be a bad thing? Coercion through taxation. Funding positive rights means taking from resources from others, which violates their property rights. A tax is really taking from someone the money that they produced with their labor to give to someone else. And they almost never really have a say in what they're doing, right? As the government grows, then, your ability to democratically change things seems to be shrinking in this country. It often causes an expansion of state control. Whoever provides your necessities controls your life. And this is one that I think gets undercovered, is the erosion of voluntary solutions. So when government monopolizes aid, community-based charity and private innovation start to shrink, right? So why do we need to do this when the government has... So, for instance, I was doing an interview. You can go back to the COVID era and hear this interview with Midwest Food Bank. Or no, it was Gleaners. And in the interview, he's like, look, private charity cannot do what the federal government does in terms of food funding, because it's just a massive amount of money. So once the government got involved in funding food aid, it prints this money, which causes inflation, which is why the power of your dollar is down 50% in 5 years, because they've printed so much money to pay for all of these programs, which means your labor goes less far in purchasing things like a home, food, groceries. And so that's like an example of hitting all three here, right? So you have less healthcare solutions, more expensive healthcare, a cheaper dollar that causes you to spend more on the basic necessities of life, and nobody wins, because housing is more expensive, healthcare is more expensive, education is limited. Because of all of this monopolization, it really starts to dig into the power of the individual to make choices for themselves. So negative rights are like owning your front yard. No one can park there without your consent. And a positive right is a right to parking, which means your neighbor gets to park there and you have to maintain it. And it's an issue of fundamental fairness. So again, I think, just to finish up, it's like, we don't, as libertarians, want people to be less healthy, less educated, less housed. We have the same goals. We want the same things. We want more housing. But how do you get there? Less restrictive zoning laws, the less restrictive building codes. Okay, well, so you just want the Wild West of building. No, if you've ever actually built anything, you understand how superfluous and silly so much of these building codes are, and how often you try to build like a shed on your backyard, and the layers of government that you have to ask. And it gets crazy. And so people just kind of go, I'm not going to spend my time on that. I'm not going to do that. Or I'll leave this community and go build elsewhere. So there's all of these trade-offs, and trade-offs are such a fundamental mode of analysis when looking at the news. Okay, you can have Obamacare, but there will be trade-offs. You can have socialized healthcare, but there will be trade-offs. You can have socialized education. There will be trade-offs. And so often, especially on the left, people who are arguing for these positive rights, they want to ignore that those trade-offs exist. And anytime someone who believes in natural rights more than positive rights comes along and said, here are the consequences of your decision, they get called heartless. And it's like, and then those bad things happen. And then everybody goes, who could have foreseen that healthcare would be more expensive with less access in 2025? Oh, well, those of us who were watching in 2013 saying this is a bad idea. So why do libertarians prioritize natural rights and negative rights? Limited government power. If rights come from the state can redefine or remove them. Natural rights restrain government authority. Right now, we're in a situation where two teams are fighting for the gun to point at our heads and force their version of morality on us instead of letting us choose. And so you are forced to join a team because if you're pro-life and Kamala wins, then my vision of the world is going to lose and it's going to be a catastrophe. And if Kamala wins, then the MAGA person thinks that everything is going to hell. And like you kind of see, if you're on the left right now, you're feeling and experiencing that the state can redefine a lot of things and can change a lot of things for you. And I so often find my friends who vote Democrat, like, they never step back and go, maybe the power is the problem. It's not that the wrong team is in charge. It's that the power exists for somebody to have the power to do these things, that they have the power to undermine universities. So how do you check the power of a state, a government? A state is a governmental system that continues on, right? A government is the people in charge at this moment. So the Trump administration, when I'm recording this, is the government, but the United States government is the state, right? So we're fighting over which government to install to impose their worldview on us, instead of going, maybe we shouldn't give the state the power to impose all of these things. Because how do you check the power of the state? Can't remember if I talked about sphere sovereignty yet, but I will. And Abraham Kuyper was this theologian, Dutch theologian at the turn of the century in the late 1800s, who was a pastor, religious leader, prime minister, university creator, really interesting guy. And his concept of sphere sovereignty is that God is sovereign over everything. And then within that big circle, there are little individual circles like the state, the family, universities, and all of these private institutions, nonprofits, right? Business. And they keep each other in check. And no one of these spheres can get too dominant and try to assume the role of God, okay? And if you look at the way that democracy checks the power of the state, it's the power of the university, the power of the media, the power of corporations. It's the legal community and the court system. It is, any number of these individual spheres, which is why you don't want presidents having the power to do a search. In the part of what Doge did is built systems to go and search funding across the federal government. And if they saw the words DEI or whatever, right, then they would just delete that funding, right? It was very broad. But because the government, those institutions like cultural institutions, universities, media companies, corporations had taken the road of accepting money, then they were able to be controlled. And so we have to limit government power because eventually the other team will be in charge. Protecting personal autonomy. Negative rights allow you to chart your own course without being compelled to serve the other's goals. How much force should you be allowed to apply to me to make me enact out your worldview? And vice versa. I'm a Christian. I'm a very conservative person. I have very Christian conservative beliefs. I don't believe that those should be enacted through government because I don't believe I should force you with government to act out my moral code or my worldview. That's controversial to a lot of Christians and right-wing Christians especially. I'm a little bit of a weirdo in that case. But at the same time, it's like, I don't want you to, and that's kind of the reaction that we have, I don't want you to force me to have to recognize your version. We can cooperate voluntarily or not voluntarily associate. We can negotiate that privately on an individual basis. But do you have a right to force me to live the way that you want to live and vice versa? It starts to get very messy and complicated and evil and angry and violent the further that we go down that road. We also avoid dependency if we focus on natural and negative rights. If we expand positive rights, it often leads to dependency on government programs which can be withdrawn or altered at any time. SNAP, Medicaid, Medicare, and there are no institutions or structures within the private, corporate, or civil society structures to help offset immediate cuts. The need doesn't go away. So one reason my wife runs a group for Embrace Grace is that after Dobbs changed the laws around abortion in the United States, she felt compelled to start an organization within our church that helped women through their pregnancy, because the women that go through her program, their need doesn't stop. Their need doesn't change, right? No matter what the government says or does not say about abortion, it doesn't change the fact that there are women in low-income circumstances who are in need of housing, transportation, food, the basic necessities of life, right? And so as the government made a change and there's need there, we stepped into that void. And I think if you look at like Doge, for instance, USAID, SNAP cuts, Medicaid cuts, I do think we have a responsibility to say to people, this goes into effect in 3 to 12 months or 2 years, and you've got to have time for institutions to be built to carry people just as we transition away from some of these things. Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia in 1974 argued that any state beyond the minimal role of protecting people from force, theft, and fraud violates rights by coercively distributing resources. The Night Watchman states. Great book, Anarchy, State, Utopia. You should check it out. So why do rights matter in a free society? You've got to think of it like oxygen. Natural rights are the air around us. They're free, universal, and impossible to truly own or grant. Legal rights are like oxygen tanks, sometimes useful, but whoever controls the valve controls your breath. The jurors in 1670 understood something timeless. Our rights are not favors to be handed out by the powerful. They're part of what it means to be human. A free society depends on remembering that and on defending those rights when they're threatened. The jurors in 1670 understood something timeless, that our rights are not favors to be handed out by the powerful. They are part of what it means to be a human being, and a free society depends on remembering that, on defending those rights when they're threatened. I think we take for granted the rights that we have in the United States. We take for granted that you have the right to speech, you have the right to the freedom of religion, you have the right to assembly, you have the freedom of movement. Part of why COVID was such a combative period is that it was really the first time in my lifetime, anyways, as a suburban guy, who grew up middle class, where my rights were impeded by the government. And boy, a lot of people didn't like that, did they? And I think that opens up the discussion to how are our current systems violating or impeding the rights of other people, other nations, being mindful of other forms of government, other systems of government. And people go, I talked with Spike the other day, Spike Cohn, and he's like, libertarians don't do well because we talk about ideas. We don't talk about stories. I agree with that. But I also think, I like talking about ideas, and I think there's a place for that. And if you don't talk about the systems and the ideas that like helps shape the stories and helps you understand, like William Meade and William Penn, it's a great story, but without the ideas underpinning that story, it's rendered meaningless. And when we look at what's happening in China, we look at what's happening in Russia, we look at what's happening in countries around the world, we have to look and step back and go, yes, we're not happy with our system, but do we want to step backwards in time towards a system where a group of people at the top get to control our right and ability to self-govern? That's really the question on the table. And that is not a commentary on Republicans or Democrats. It's a commentary on both. And that's why I reject their entire premise every election cycle, because we have to step up and say, here are our rights. We have to demand our rights. Voting's fine, but you also have to be vocal about these ideas, understand these ideas, and learn more about them. So I thank you for watching this. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you found it informative. And thank you for joining us, and we will see you again next week.